Okay, so welcome to the fifth or sixth conversation about creative practice research. Today we have Matthew Hawkins with us, and the conversation is all going to be about how we peer review creative practice research. My interest in that stems from a challenge around peer reviewing creative practice research that isn't screen-based or isn't necessarily text-based. So, for example, an opera in the back of a pub. How do you peer review that so that there is a sense that it meets some standard or criteria? Peer review seems to be an important thing in academia still. When we write papers for journals, it gets peer reviewed, and that's seen as a benchmark and a standard. So how do we apply that and explore that as a possibility for creative practice research, which can take many, many forms? So I'm going to hand over to Matthew and invite him to introduce himself, and that will unpack some of the work that he's been doing with Screenworks around peer review, which has been, in my mind, is a very successful, is a very good model for us to look at. So Matthew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. Hi, Roy. Yeah, thank you for the invite, and nice to see so many people joining us today. Yes, I'm Matthew Hawkins. I am on the editorial board at Screenworks. I'm one of the more junior members of the editorial board, or I've been here for a couple of years now. Um, and I work at London South Bank University, where I run the film practice course in the School of Arts and Social Sciences. And my practice is I'm a filmmaker and I work in predominantly I switch between fiction, film, and documentary with a little bit of artist moving image in there as well. And I am one of the co-conveners of the International Network of Experimental Fiction Filmmaking, um, which is focused on practice as research with an emphasis on fiction film.
Thank you. So, could you just talk a little bit about your role within the Screenworks editorial team and how you became involved with the journal? Is it a journal?
It is a journal, yes. It's a journal. It's the Screenworks, the journal for creative practice media, um, screen-based, screen-based media. I've been on the editorial board for around 3 years now. I joined, I think, in early 2022. Um, and yeah, I responded to a call for new editors. We've had another one recently, so the editorial board is expanding and it's growing, and I think that's a reflects the increased and the ongoing interest in Screenworks as a journal, um, and the increased number of publications we are getting. Um, I'd say, yeah, so I've been there for 3 years, and we have Charlotte Crofts, who's our editor in chief, who's been it's nearly 20 years that Screenworks has been running for now. It's
I was going to ask if you could unpack a little for us what the original motivation for Screenworks, the development of Screenworks, if you're familiar with it. I assume you're.
yeah, absolutely. And I think if you are interested in the sort of history of Screenworks, and I think it is a quite an important history, Charlotte Crofts and Alex Neville wrote a great article in 2018 called Publishing Screen Media Practice Research, which is focused on the evolution of the journal, but also on peer reviewing um, as well. And that's published in the Journal of Media Practice. And the original motivation was to help practices researchers in screen media to fully and clearly articulate the sort of researchness of their work. So how their practice is research. And that came out of really the research assessment exercise, the RAE, in the early 2000s, which is now the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, and that shift in the UK context to sort of audit our research. And there wasn't really any, before Screenworks, I don't think in the UK context anyway, nobody was publishing screen practices research. So Screenworks started to do that in association with the Journal for Media Practice. And the first few issues were on DVD, and they were published on DVD alongside the journal. And Charlotte and John Dovey and the original team wanted to develop um, a sort of rigorous space in which people could articulate and publish their screen practice as research that that could really allow people to write about their work in a clear way and in a way that responded explicitly to the demands of universities and exercises like the research assessment exercise.
I, I, I think at the time that there was also a sense of an agenda to establish creative practice as a
Mhm.
research, but it wasn't, that time was still wasn't really recognized.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
was starting to be. So there
Mhm.
was a sense that this Screenworks was a bit of a trailblazer, if I
Yeah, I
could
think
say
it
that,
was. Yeah.
and
Mhm.
it was important to that process of saying, well, look, it is a rigorous practice, and it
Yeah.
is a research practice. So I
Yeah.
think it had that.
Yeah, it was about getting that work recognized and taken seriously as an academic practice. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about the peer review model that
Mm.
you've had, because over the years, I imagine it's kind of refined into a very specific process. Do you want to kind of walk us through what the peer review process is at Screenworks?
Mhm. So it's in some ways it's similar to sort of traditional academic journals, in that we seek two peer reviewers for the work. So there are always two peer reviewers. The work is sent out to these peer reviewers. Um, the reviewers assess the work, they send their reviews back to us, and the reviewers will make comments and recommendations on the work. So they might say, this work can be published without changes, or they might ask for minor or major changes to the written statement, or they might ask for some changes to the practice as well. So just in case people don't know, the format of Screenworks is that people will submit a piece of screen practice as research. So a film uploaded to Vimeo. So we embed our work via Vimeo, and that will be accompanied by a 2,000 word written statement. And both the film and the statement go out for peer review. Uh, what Screenworks does differently, perhaps, is that we publish the peer reviews. And I think there are other journals that do that now as well. So in Transition, the journal for video essays, will publish their peer reviews alongside the work. Um, and it's single blind. So that's another kind of differentiation, I guess, from traditional peer reviewing, in that the authors don't know who it is that's reviewing the work, but the reviewers know who the author is.
So when the reviews, even when the reviews are published, they're still
Mhm.
anonymized. So
They're still anonymized, yeah. Yeah.
so what happens when reviewers request changes to the screen media? Does that have to be implemented, or is, because I recall a seminar last year at the Mexico conference that there was
Mhm.
discussion about not all, it's not always possible to implement changes. So is that an issue, do you think?
Um, Less so now than it used to be, I think. Um, because with the sort of digital editing, non-linear editors, the accessibility of these editing suites, everybody can edit on their laptop now, pretty much. Um, it's not as expensive to make those changes. So 20 years ago, you might be hiring an edit suite, you might be working on a kind of offline edit and an online edit and really complex workflows. It's a little bit easier now to make those changes if needed. But I would say changes to the Screenworks are not, they're asked for less than changes to the statement, I would say, on the whole. And the changes tend to be recommendations,
Right.
which can be taken on board. Um,
But the changes to the statement feel, in some ways, from a research practice point of view, more useful because they're what you've got there is the peer reviewers are helping you articulate the research,
mhm,
which so in a sense that there is, with a journal article you would obviously go and do changes,
mhm.
blah blah, but actually what it's the writing here, the articulation of the research is the statement. Is that correct?
I think, yeah, the statement is really important. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that is the space where the research questions, the research methods, the rigor of the practice is articulated. And yeah, I would agree. From my perspective, I can't speak on behalf of everybody, of course, but from my perspective, making sure that that statement is really rigorous and really well formatted and really well articulated is super important. Um,
Do you, this is a bit of an aside, it's not in our question list,
yeah,
but
yeah,
does
sure.
that not privilege? Because this is one of the tensions here is that people will say,
Mhm.
and I don't know if I 100% agree with them, but people will say that the work should stand on its own as evidence of the research, and that what we're doing here is that the universities or the academia still requires us to produce text in order to um, legitimate the research. Is that a tension, do you think, or is that just just a nonsense? I swing both ways.
I don't buy that argument, to be honest with you. I've heard it a lot over the years, um, but I don't really know what that means, that the work should stand for itself.
Mhm.
Um, I think that you can watch the work and appreciate the work on many different levels, and you can watch the work as a piece of art. Um, but the statement allows you to articulate the research practice, your questions, your objectives, and also it allows you to replicate that. It allows other researchers to replicate your methods and methodologies that you might have developed whilst making the work. So you can appreciate the work on its own and in and of itself. And we have beautiful films submitted to the journal on an almost weekly basis now. Um, but to fully articulate the research, I think that statement is really important.
Yeah,
It's really important
I,
for other researchers to build upon the work that you might be doing.
I think I absolutely agree. I think there are occasions when you look at a piece of work or experience something and you can see the research layered into it as a
Mm.
research tool, but it's not appropriate for all
Yeah.
practice to evidence itself to be to
Mhm.
wear the research as a badge of honor,
Yeah.
because the questions might be embedded in a methodology that delivers it rather than
Mhm.
the output as
Yeah, exactly that. And I think something like an audiovisual essay, for example, um, will quite often quite clearly articulate the research in the work itself through the use of text, through the use of voiceover. Um, and you might have a piece of practice as research that maybe has a more of a sociological bent to it that involves maybe interviews, and the research might be clearly articulated in the film itself. But quite often, I think that work is more leans towards documentation of another research process rather than artistic practice as research in and of itself.
yeah, yeah.
Makes sense.
So how do you support the reviewers in responding to works? Is there a kind of a mechanism support? Are there rubrics? What how does that support happen?
Yeah, so I think one advantage actually of publishing the peer reviews is that other reviewers can go back and read peer reviews of other pieces of work, so you can see how other people have done it, and the fact and like there are good practice is sort of open and transparent on the website in the journal. And I think that in and of itself is quite a helpful thing. I remember the first time I was asked to do a peer review for a sort of 8,000 word article, I was very happy that somebody valued my opinion enough to ask me to do a peer review. But there was no guidance. I mean, I was just given the article and told to write, 500 to 700 words, which is quite daunting. Um, so, you can look at other people's peer reviews, but we also we have a few guiding questions, I would say, rather than rubrics. So we don't try to be overly prescriptive, but we do ask peer reviewers to comment on the quality of the scholarship, the originality of the work, the significance and the style, ranging from sort of excellent to poor and somewhere in between. And we ask peer reviewers to comment explicitly. We say, you might want to comment on the novelty of the work, the originality of the practice. Um, we ask the reviewers to consider that. We ask them if they think the work is contributing something new to the field, and we ask them to comment on the quality of the overall quality of the accompanying statement, um, the organization, the argument, and the theoretical and artistic context as well. And peer reviewers can be in dialogue with the editors also. So if they have any questions or if they want any guidance, we're happy to help there as well. And I think the ethos of Screenworks right from the beginning was around building a supportive community. And that's about helping artists and practice as research scholars to develop their work, but also to work with peer reviewers as well.
Mhm. Well, I think that's very important because I think there's still lots of work to be done there.
Mhm.
I find a lot of I've only been teaching for about 20 years, which feels like a long time, but maybe not. I don't know. But what I've met over those years, I've had a lot of people come in from practice
Mhm.
fields as artists or filmmakers, whatever, and getting them to shift to being practice-based researchers takes some time because
Mhm.
it's quite a nuanced and abstract kind of idea. So
Mhm.
actually, the supporting and kind of holding people and scaffolding it are all the kinds of things that I think are really, really helpful.
Mhm.
If someone submits something, what is the process? Is there a process where, like, you say, okay, so this is accepted or rejected, or
Mhm.
accepted and then sent out to review? Or is it just accepted and sent out to review? If the reviews come back, is it because, like with the journal, it's like accepted with revisions, major
Mhm.
revisions? Is there a process like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Roy. So yeah, what happens is work is sent to us, and then the editorial board will look at the work initially and decide. We very rarely reject a piece of work. What we might do is, if we think that the work needs developing, we might send it back to the submitter with some advice on how they might improve the work, um, and invite them to submit that work, send that work back to us. That only really tends to happen when they don't follow the guidance around writing the written statement. So we do have some. The statement is formatted in a very sort of specific way. Um, so I'm just reminding myself of the format. So the statement, we asked them, the authors, to articulate their research questions. Then we asked for a section on context, a section on impact, and then to have their references as well. So as long as the authors follow that structure, and it really clearly is a piece of practice as research, we will then send it out to the peer reviews. Then it will come back with the recommendations, and people will make changes, or it will go, or we will publish it straight
Is
away.
is there like are there because when I was at the seminar last year, I got a sense that sometimes you go to a second round of reviews. Is that something that happens, or am I mistaken there?
Um, Sometimes, occasionally, if you get two, I know this was one of the questions you wanted to ask, Roy. If you get two peer reviewers who disagree, um, which again doesn't happen that often. I would say, most of the time our reviews are fairly aligned. But if we do have a case where two reviewers are in complete disagreement, we will ask for a third peer reviewer. Um, I know some journals will, if you have one reviewer that says accept and one reviewer that says reject, they will always go with the negative review, and they will reject. We don't operate in that way because again we want to support people,
Mhm.
and we will go out for a third peer review.
So what over the time you've been involved, have you done quite a bit reviewing? Do the editors do reviewing, or the reviewers kept separate from editors? I'm not sure of your policy there.
So yeah, the reviewers are kept separate from the editorial board. So we will do that initial pass, and then we send it out to peer reviewers, and we have quite a large body of peer reviewers that's growing all and changing all of the time. But occasionally we do peer reviews. So
What would you say? What's your top tip from a successful submission then?
so I mean, to Screenworks particularly, I mean, try and follow the format. The format is there to really help you clearly articulate the research and articulate the value of the work. I think that's really important. So follow that structure for the research statement, which really helps with that contextualization. And I think engaging with the peer review process also is really important. So to be open to those revisions, and
It
and I
can be
think
quite an emotional moment. For my first reaction when I get peer reviews is it's often quite emotional, and I'm never going to write again. Sort of thing. And then you calm down a bit and go, oh, and then you look at it, and I always find it very, very useful. You can't always take on board everything.
Mhm,
There's sometimes one or two things that you go, oh, actually, and that might be a decision for you or the editor, I guess. But
mhm.
what are there recurring feedback, themes that just pop up in the reviewers all the time that you would go, well, these are the three things that reviewers always say?
No, not particularly, because I think really that there's such a wide variety of work that gets submitted to us. So we have fiction films, we have documentary, loads of artist film and video, and artist film and video. I mean, no two films are the same. I mean, that's really varied in and of itself. Lots of video essays are coming to us now as well. Um, so the work really is varied. Um, but I think one of the most important things to remember as a creative practitioner or par academic, especially if you're coming to it for the first time, is to sort of familiarize yourself with almost the definitions of research and to understand how you might articulate that in um, in your own practice. And there's the ref has published some guidance on that actually, and we complain a bit about the ref and the bureaucratic nature of it and so on. But there are some great documents on the website for the ref. Um, and in relation to practice as research, the ref says practice as research, and this is, I think, appropriate for all research actually, is a process of investigation that leads to new insights effectively shared. I think that statement allows us to effectively share those new insights. I think that's really important. And it can include the invention and generation of new ideas, images, performance artifacts, including design, where these lead to new or substantial improved insights about the discipline itself. Um, and this creation of new knowledge, or the use of existing knowledge in new and creative ways as to generate new concepts, methodologies, and understandings. And I think this idea of using your practice as research to create new concepts, methodologies, and understandings um, is a really useful way to think about, what your own practice is doing. And a few years ago, there was a AHRC funded research project on film. It was a filmmaking research network, I think, with Sussex University and a university in Australia as well. And they articulated film practice as research in a really simple but I think useful way. They say film practices research is new knowledge about filmmaking that is acquired for filmmaking through filmmaking.
Okay.
And I think if you're thinking about different types of practices research, if you replace filmmaking with opera or theatre or
Yeah.
dance, it does the same thing. So how can we learn more about our discipline through practicing our discipline, and how might we create new concepts and methodologies that allow us to engage or understand more about um,
Yeah. Yeah.
what
Yeah.
filmmaking is, for example. I come from a film background, and I think film has been doing that almost since its inception. If you think about Eisenstein and Kuleshov, the invention of concepts, the invention of montage and different ideas around montage is a wonderful example as practice as research. Or Jean Epstein's creation of the concept of photogeny, which he created through making his own films himself. Um, and I think the work that we're doing in Screenworks is an extension of the work that was done by people like Epstein and Eisenstein in the 20s. It's
Absolutely. I wouldn't deny that at all. So let's move on to some questions about beyond the screen, because
Mm,
this is what interests me in a way about Screenworks and other journals where
mm,
they do peer review is how do we kind of apply some of this learning and some of this supportive sort of way of doing things to other areas of practice.
mm,
A lot of my practice these days, I've started out in film and I do kind of immersive audio-visual
mm,
installations now, and there's no way that I can submit that to a journal and say,
mm.
off you go, have a look at that, unless you can come to it. So what do you think are the challenges around adapting the sort of processes that you're familiar with for non-screen based um, creations?
Yeah, I think, yeah, for stuff like immersive media, it's really difficult. Um, but I think then the statement almost becomes more important, you know, because you can document this immersive media. You can record the sound and you can photograph the event and you can record the event. But with sound installation, to really understand how that's working, you need to be in the middle of the room surrounded by those speakers in that particular configuration, right? Otherwise, you'll never really experience it in the way that it should be experienced. But maybe you can articulate that through the statement. Um, I think the sort of transparency in the dialogue that Screenworks tries to create is broadly transferable. Um, and of course, it's not perfect. There are problems with publishing the peer reviews. That's not like it's not perfect, but I think the pros outweigh the cons.
Mhm.
Um,
And I think, one of the things that we're trying to do, or certainly my position as someone who's leading the sort of creative practice research within the department I'm part of,
mhm.
um, is is actually developing that ability to articulate. So we've got lots of people who are doing fantastic practice.
Yeah.
Are they articulating it, and are they seeing how what they're doing can be classified as an output? Obviously, from the UK context,
Mhm.
ref is all important. So
Mhm.
I can see that actually the written statement is kind of really valuable and really important.
Mhm.
Are there things that you don't think would translate well, or do you think everything would kind of translate to a different context?
But I think I say we have the advantage of the documenting the practice is much easier uh, for screen-based research, although installation work is a bit more complex. Um, I'd say quite a lot of it would be transferable. Um, you might want to reconsider um, some of the criteria for assessing the work. Does that fully align with sort of live performance or installation? Um, But actually, the criteria that we developed at Screenworks was, I guess, inspired by the conditions imposed by things like the ref.
Mm.
So, we have an impact section, for example, and we know that we are asked to articulate the impact our work has had. And that's really important for things like the ref, and it's really important for UK universities. I think universities worldwide. So, having a section where artists can fully articulate the impact will be really important, and that's quite transferable.
Yeah,
But
and
understanding what your sort of the conditions that are imposed on us and responding to those, I think is really important.
ultimately, yeah, in a way, you are, you know, certainly in the UK, you are working towards a 300-word rep statement at
Hmm.
some point in time. And the way you described the format seemed very familiar to me. I've done quite a lot of analysis of ref statements and
Mm.
tried to distill them into a model, and it sounds very much like your format. It was very recognizable
Mm.
to me, and ultimately, again, there is a sense that if why would you want people to do this? Well, it's because this is articulating your practice is an important part of what universities do, because otherwise, how do other people learn from what you're doing?
Yeah.
Because you
Mm.
can't,
Exactly.
as we've talked about, you can't just sit there, or even if you go and have the experience, the research question may be something to do with method, or it may be something to do with something a bit more philosophical about this.
Mm.
Um, so you do need that kind of writing.
Mm.
So you've kind of touched on this really, but the question is what advice would you give to another journal or editorial board considering adapting or building peer review processes for practice-led research? And I said earlier before the interview started, I'm presenting a paper to the International Journal for Creative Media Research that has kind of phoenix-like risen from the ashes of Bath Spa University, and so we're kind of actually thinking about this and how we could do that. So, what advice could you give us as editorial board seeking to do this?
Yeah. Well, I think what I really value about Screenworks and the work that um, the original editorial board did all those years ago was to try and to emphasize community and that community building. The peer review process is not there to gatekeep. We're not seen as gatekeepers of work. We are part of a creative practice community, and what we want to do is to elevate the practice of our peers and work together in order to improve people's work. Um, so I think maintaining a level of transparency that promotes a level of accountability, clarity, and allows that level of shared learning is really important, um, actually. And yeah, as you were saying, Royce, we've all received peer reviews that have been can be a bit crushing. Um, and I don't think that happens as often at Screenworks, because when we asked people to peer review, we do say, when you're writing your peer review, try and be constructive and write it, and keep in mind when you're writing that this will be published and it will be accessible and it will be readable not only by the authors of the work but by the general public. And I think that really helps to build a more collegial atmosphere. And so often we get responses from our authors that will say, can you thank the peer reviewers for the advice they gave because it really helped to improve the work, or it really helped to improve the statement, or it really helped me to articulate my ideas and clarify my ideas. I might have been struggling on a concept and the peer reviewers helped me to work through that concept. And that's really satisfying when that happens. And it happens quite a lot.
I, I, I was going to say something really important, and it's just completely gone from my head. It was to do with no, it's gone. So, well, we'll pass over that. What wonderful insight that I was going to share with you. So, um, if there was one thing that you could change about how the academy understands and values creative research, what would that be?
So I think, I mean, the academy is quite a broad term, isn't it? But I think the sort of arts and humanities, I think they really understand practice as research now, and I think they really do value it. I
Mhm.
think a lot has changed over the last 20 years.
Mm.
Um, and I think when Screenworks was first, when Screenworks was first launched, it was to fight for the validity of practice as research
Mm.
and to fight for recognition and for fight to be taken seriously. And I do think that that battle has been won. I do think we're taken seriously, and I do think people understand us. And I think we should avoid the urge to pretend like nobody gets what we're doing and nobody understands us. And people do within our community, and there is a huge community of really incredible practices researchers in the UK and across the world doing brilliant work. And I do think there is a real sense of community of scholars out there but our scholarship just happens to be artistic practice rather than just articles and books, which we all write. Many of us write articles and books as well. I think some some funders, maybe this is controversial. So I know AHRC have a Practice as Research Award and BAFS have a Practice as Research Award. Um, and it seems to me like BAFS sort of understands the nuanced nature of practice as research in which it's articulating
Mhm.
new insights about film through film. Whereas I think maybe AHRC tends to value or see film practice as articulating research that has already been done on another platform.
Right. Okay.
If that makes sense, so maybe a sociologist has done some research um, on health making practices in Southeast London. This was a project I was involved in a few years ago, and we film interviews with people and we put that into a documentary, and it's an articulation of almost a sociological research.
Okay.
Whereas that kind of practices research is really valuable and it's really important, but that is an articulation of research through filmmaking.
Mhm.
Whereas there's a practices research that invents new concepts,
Yeah.
forms, methodologies that informs the practice. And I think maybe that's more important. Although AHNC funded my PhD, which is practices research, so
Right.
I guess.
I definitely agree. I think it's a very different landscape for creative practice research. It was when I started teaching nearly 20 years ago. Um, it was still not really recognised, and certainly the RAE didn't recognise it. Whereas now,
Mhm.
after the last ref, you look at the submissions and the amount of creative practice and the way it was articulated, and the way
Yeah.
that it's now kind of recognised and seen as a valuable part of the research submission for universities. I think you're dead right. I think there's still
And also creative practitioners, really importantly, are on these assessment panels for
yeah,
the
yeah,
rep.
yeah,
They do sit there, it's
absolutely. I think the challenge is still around communicating the opportunities or the sensibilities of practice as research to
Mhm.
early career researchers and practitioners who are just coming into
Mhm.
academia. That's really where, because I know we've got people who are making films,
Mhm.
and I say to them, "But are you doing research?" And they go,
Mhm.
"No," and I'm like, "Well, I think you are. I think you just haven't really sat down and thought about it."
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
it happens. And I think an interesting shift that has happened over a few years with the accessibility of filmmaking. Everybody has a camera on their mobile phone. Editing software is more freely available. We are starting to see um, theoreticians or people who were traditionally theoreticians, pure theoreticians, making films as well. So, whereas previously Screenworks would often see filmmakers that were publishing academic research for the first time, we now see academic researchers that are making films for the first time as well, which is an interesting switch, which I quite enjoy.
yeah, well, good, good. That's where we want to be, I think, really.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so.
So let's before we go to the audience and ask open up for questions. Is there anything that you would like to share that you felt that we haven't really covered in the conversation so far?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot. I think one thing that I think when we're talking about people, filmmakers sort of entering into that practice as research area for the first time, um, I think what's really important, and this it comes back to what makes for a good submission to Screenworks, is for these filmmakers to really understand what they are trying to do with their work, to understand what are their aims and objectives of the practice, and to be clear about these before they start their practice, so they can develop their aims and objectives in the pre-production stage, rather than trying to almost backfill
Mm,
that what their research aims might perhaps be. So to ask yourself, like, are you developing a new concept? Are you developing a new methodology for filmmaking or a new understanding about a particular mode of practice? And can you articulate clearly this new concept or methodology in a way that might be ultimately it might be sort of repeatable? And can you articulate that in a way in which other researchers might be able to use those concepts and methods in their own work, and maybe in different contexts, and build upon these methods perhaps. Um, there's a great screen work called Camrex, which was published maybe around 2016. And it's a documentary by Mark Chapman, and I always show this to my students when I'm trying to get them into practice as research. And it's a wonderful documentary about a sort of halfway house for men who are quite vulnerable, suffering from mental health issues and addiction. And what Mark was trying to do was to articulate a what he called a documentary interiority. And he sort of developed a methodology to document the interior life of these vulnerable men. And he articulates that in a really clear way. And that's super transferable. You can, all of a sudden, he's developed these methods for a new concept, which is a documentary interiority, which you can take to document many different interiorities. Or as a fiction filmmaker myself, who's interested in this idea of a cinematic interiority, I might be able to take his methods and then use that in my own fiction film practice, for example. And when practice as research does that, I think that's my favorite type of practice as research, and I think that's really valuable. Of course, it's not the only type. There are many different ways,
mhm.
but that's the sort of work that I really like.
Yeah. And coming back to the statement, this is the value of it is that,
Mhm.
and actually, I almost kind of wanted to say, oh, there's the experimental method, isn't it?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that that's part of the thing with creative practice research is that to a certain extent early on there was a bit of a scrabble to say, oh no, our research is just as good. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that was the wrong way to approach it. I think the way that we approach it now is to say our research is different,
Mhm.
but it still has the same value.
Yeah, it's a different articulation or a different way of articulating maybe
Yeah,
ideas and developing ideas. Mhm.
yeah. So I'm going to ask people to drop questions into the chat if you've got any questions, and you'd like Matthew to answer them. Please put them in chat. So there's one catcher has asked, I know this is a chicken and egg comment, but
Mhm.
the practice can also lead, potentially allowing for unexpected methods to surface. Well, yes, I did. In fact, the last one of these it was a conversation about experimental approaches because I find that I find it difficult to articulate my research questions until after I've done the research
Mm.
because very often I use sort of more sort of devising approaches where
Mhm.
I'm just playing around with things to see what comes up, and I kind of work with groups of people to do this, and it's sometimes the thing that we're actually doing doesn't become apparent necessarily straight away. So we
Mhm.
might start with a trigger or a thing, and then we kind of work forward, and it's very frustrating. Some people don't like it. They say tell us what we're doing. I go, well, I don't know, trust the process. And generally, so far, the process has outputted things of interest. So, yeah. So, could you speak to that a little bit, maybe? And is
Yeah, I think
there a
that's
sense
really
that it
important
that it
what
can
I
be either
mentioned.
way round?
Yeah, and I think that idea of uncertainty is really an important part of the research practice as well. Yeah, and thank you for that, Katya, because I don't think I fully articulated that. And and we can almost see our practice as if, if we put almost a scientific hat on, we go to a scientist might go to the laboratory, we might go to the set or the studio and we try out ideas and we see what works. And yeah, we have to absolutely be open to the unexpected and what might emerge, and that might be super, super valuable. So yeah, I think I agree completely.
Absolutely. Don't shy away from the unexpected and embrace the chaos. I like to.
Yeah. And you might go back. I mean, I have a PhD student at the moment that's doing a really interesting project on Twitch. Um, and he's making a fiction film using the Twitch platform. And he has done a series of sort of smaller experiments, working in different ways in different contexts, and then reflecting on that and then building on that and being open and learning through doing. And that's really important.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So we have a question from Ava, who's a non-screen practitioner in applied theatre, and there is pressure on people to measure impact. How do you measure impact? I've got a few things to say about that, but Matthew, why don't you go first?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ava, and it's a really important one. Not j- for, not just for the ref, but also if we're thinking about applying for promotions in our own institutions as well. We have to University is becoming more sort of data driven, um, I guess. And there are different ways of doing it. Um, and quite often you might want to, so for example, I have organize a conference and a festival, and at the festival um, we note how many people have come to the event, but we also ask them to reflect on the event. I think it's a flawed way of doing it, but we have to try and do something. That's one way of measuring. Um,
Eric Nudston answered this question for me some
mm,
years ago when we were talking about it. We were doing a symposium on this subject, and he said it's virtually impossible to measure impact, but what you can do is you can measure pathways to impact.
mm,
And the problem is that very often what we do is because of what we do is often project based. The project finishes, but the impact might not happen until some years later.
mm,
Or the impact might not be just due to the thing that you've done. It might be a combination of things that leads to change of some kind later. But what you can do is you can measure the pathways to impact. So you can build into your projects an experience which might later lead to impact, and you can measure that. And so there, where you got Matthew, where you were talking about getting people to reflect or getting people to comment or finding different ways for people to sort of feed back on that experience and then saying, well, this is a pathway to impact, and don't try and claim it as impact because it might take years, and if you don't have the funding to come back to do a longitudinal study,
mm.
you're never ever really going to be to measure that. So that's I'm down with Eric on that one, and I find it very useful in sort of building projects is to say, well, we have these impact goals, but we won't be able to measure them. But what we can do is measure the pathways that we're introducing.
Yeah. And I think we can think about impact in the way that the ref wants us to think about impact, but we can also think about the impact that our work has on the world around us and the people that participate with us and the impact we have on their lives and the impact they have on our lives as well. And I think um, that's really important. I think we should really value that. If you might put on a performance to 20 people in the back of a pub. Um, but that has an impact on their lives, and you might be working with people that have never acted before in the theatre, and that might have an impact on their lives. Or I made a documentary a couple of years ago about a woman who lost her husband, and it allowed her to um, articulate the impact there, which I think is articulate that I think that was really important.
Yeah. So, I was introduced to something called a theory of change, and it's a model for developing creative practice. It's not necessarily research related, but it can be used. So you start off with your impact. This is the impact, and then you work back. And as you build the project, you are building in those pathways, and you are, in theory, at least, building in ways of evaluating and measuring the pathways as you go forward. And so at the end, you have a collection of data that says, look, we can't possibly measure the impact, but we think that because of these things, it will lead to impact. And so you can kind of evidence things in the journey, as it were. Does that make sense, Matthew? Am I?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So I have a question here. So this is quite an interesting one because obviously we haven't really gone into the sort of detail of the evolution of the Screenworks methodology. But the
Mhm.
question here is, when Screenworks started, were statements asked for in the early days, or was that something that came out of a development process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I believe that we always asked for statements. So originally, Screenworks was part of the Journal for Media Practice, which is now published online, but 20 years ago it was a print journal, and so the statements would be in the print journal, and a DVD would be attached to the journal. So I think it's always been there, and I think the in terms of the length of the statement, I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Mhm.
Um, but I think the format was inspired by um, the pressure to articulate
Yeah.
our research. But I'm going to put into the chat a link to Charlotte Crofts and Alex Neville's article on the development of Screenworks. The answer might be in there. I've read it recently again, but I can't remember. But it is a really
Yeah.
useful and fantastic article.
And that's interesting because I can remember, getting the journal and getting the DVD with it, uh, and interestingly, I think at the time there was a sort of, well, how peer review seemed to be a clear sort of standard of referability.
Hmm.
But I'm actually getting the sense with the Ref 2029, which those of us who are still in the chat who are not from the UK probably don't care about, but for us in the UK, it's important. I'm getting a very strong sense that that peer review is not being seen as important anymore, and it made me think, oh, so maybe we don't need to worry about this. Maybe it's not an issue for us as creative practice researchers. Do you want to comment on that? Maybe I'm just living in a fantasy world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to predict what's going to come from the next ref. I mean, but there's lots of people working hard to try and understand and preempt what we're going to be asked for, right? Um, I think I think peer review is important from a community practice and a community perspective. So rather than that, the gatekeeping nature of peer review, I don't think is particularly useful. Um, but helping people to, I think it's useful to develop a sense of community. And I really like to see a world in which peer review was more dialogic. And I think that's something that creative practitioners are really useful, actually. If I make a film, I will show it to my friends and I will ask for feedback, right? And I think to have a dialogic peer reviewing process where um, you show it to a critical friend almost that will yeah, peer review via podcast,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah. Um, where they can comment on the work as it's developing and work with them to help them improve the work and strengthen the work. That would be great. It's a bit of a utopian idea because unfortunately we know time is against us in the fact that certainly in the UK context, but I think it's probably the same all over the world. We are overworked and there's a lot of demand on our time, and
True that.
it's really difficult.
Mm.
But I would love to, to work more dialogically in
I
that period.
think I think the whole sense of community that you talk about is really important. And when I lead a group through a special issue, which we're doing one at the moment, at some point in time, I will get all of the authors involved to peer review each other, and we'll have a workshop to kind of get people started on that. And one of the reasons we do that is because nobody teaches you how to do peer review.
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody teaches you.
absolutely.
We're just kind of thrown in there.
Hmm.
And so we do that to try and get people to say, well, okay, you need to be supportive and you need to be constructive and
Yeah, it's a
work
great
towards
idea.
it. And I think it really helps.
Hmm.
Um, so I think the community side of it is important, and it's not something you get with that. Often that when you're writing for journals, I feel it is a bit almost adversarial. It's kind of
Yeah, it can be.
gatekeeping. We've got to get through this. There isn't always necessarily the sense that I'm part of a community.
Mhm.
So it's a question from Laurie. Period. So let's see. So great, thank you. It would be great if you were right, Roy. Right about something. That'd be important. Uh, so Laurie says she's done a bunch of peer review, conversation podcasts, and reviews. Always say how much more. Oops, it just went away. How much more useful and enjoyable the process was rather than sitting home writing anonymously to an unknown researcher. Yeah, because you become a part of something, don't you? Really. And then Scott is anyone to look better understand practice research, see the Prague reports on practice 2021 report on practice research. So that's really useful. Thank you
Yeah,
for that,
it's
Scott.
a great document, Scott. I've some of the filmmaking practice network documentations were published is published on that site as well, and they're a really really good read.
I don't
Um,
know if Prague still exists. I occasionally see mention of it, but when you try and email them, I never get anything back. So I
the
don't know.
site is still live and it still has the
Yeah.
documentation now, which is great. Look, can I ask Laurie, what area do you work in? What sort of practice do you do, and um, what journey
Yeah.
that allows for this conversation? Because I think it's wonderful, a wonderful way of doing it.
Hi, thanks for asking me. Yeah, I do research into using podcasting as a form of peer review and also
Ah,
as a form of knowledge creation. So again,
mhm,
it's very much practice-based research.
mhm,
Yeah, so it's really for me, it's been really freeing to be able to speak to colleagues and you know, and have that collaborative sense of moving the research forward rather
mhm,
than, yeah, I just find when people write anonymously and it's anonymous um, researcher that it's such a chore. It
mhm.
feels more like a chore than anything, but when you're actually having a conversation with the person, it's so freeing and so insightful. And just,
Mhm.
yeah, I really do feel we have to kind of move beyond this very text-oriented way of doing peer review
Yeah,
and research, frankly, and
yeah,
publishing research.
yeah. That's right. Yeah,
Hmm.
it feels less like homework, right? You can,
Yeah, you get something from it. Both parties, all
yeah,
parties get something
yeah.
from it, right?
I
Yeah.
think it's great. Yeah.
So we've been talking for an hour, or a little over an hour, just about an hour. So I think unless there's any more questions, I'm going to say thank you to Matthew, and thank you for everyone for joining us. I will post this. I put the link to the web page in the chat where this and all the other seminars will be posted. I may do some more next year. I'm not entirely sure. Um, uh, so still watch this space. Thanks, which I live. Sorry, someone just posted there. Are there existing as far as I'm aware, sorry, this is from Matthias. As far as I'm aware, all of the journals that do peer review of creative practice research do it for screen-based media. That's my understanding. I don't think I found any that do other forms of practice, but don't quote me. And the International Journal for Creative Media Research, I am presenting a paper to the editorial board in a few weeks' time to kind of pitch that we should absolutely sort of seize that space and do that. So do sort of sign up to follow the International Journal of Creative Media Research, and you may see a call for something along the lines of what we've been talking about here, but that may be still a little way away. Matthew, are you aware of any other journals that, other than screen-based ones? The Screenworks is the one in Australia that is called Sightlines.
Sightlines, yeah.
Again,
Sightlines doing
it's
great work.
screen-based media.
Based. There's the Journal of Embodied Research is really great. Lots of dance researchers publish there, but they publish in a screen format. Journal of Artistic Research JAR is great, but that's really flexible in terms of they have their own format. But yeah, I mean, I'm a film researcher, so but yeah, if you're interested in dance and choreography, the Journal of Embodied Research I think is really interesting.
Cool. And there's still more questions. No, that's it. So I'm going to wrap up now and say thank you, Matthew. Thank you to everyone, and do check the website in a couple of days, and I will have the video up there and you can share it to your friends. Apologies for the quality of my camera. I don't know what's going on there. But thank you, Matthew, and farewell. I'm going to
Been a
stop
pleasure.
recording.
Lovely. Thanks everyone, and thank you for all of